So then one of the wonderful things about living in Canada and having the CBC is that we have all these fascinating documentaries of people who have chosen forgiveness or who have worked their way through the Canadian correctional system in a variety of responses. And we're able to, I use a lot of those stories in the curriculum. And I contrast that with a video that's included in the original curriculum called The Other Side of Death Row, where, and that's a documentary that really illustrates very well how the death sentence is often not a helpful piece for victims' families because of the way the appeals are dragged out, and in their view, the sentence is never carried out because they're waiting 20 and 30 years for that execution, and how that holds people in limbo and so on. So, and then we are able to contrast that with people like Wilma Dirksen and Margot Van Sleutman, who choose a different way of responding to their pain. But I think obviously it's very important to say that either of those outcomes are possible, right? I'm very careful to illustrate the full range of victim response to a situation. And then the men have to figure out a way to live with whatever their own victim's experience is of that situation, rather than to push for a particular outcome. And I spend a lot of time contrasting justice with vengeance. So justice, many victims would understand that to mean that it's actually caring for the victim, right? And what does that mean, and what can the men do? And then we spend a lot of time talking about indirect amends. One of the fascinating things that has come out of this for me, not entirely unanticipated, but probably something the public wouldn't picture, is how many of the prisoners who take the course genuinely want to find some way to make amends, and they know that being in direct contact with their victims is not likely that option, right? That's a rare situation. So what can they be doing instead in order to create that healing and be contributing to a greater sense of community safety? And there are people who are working in the system right now would know that there are many barriers in place to allowing that to happen. But it's been a really repetitive piece of the men really wanting to find ways to do things better. One of the fascinating outcomes for me is, like that man who started this whole thing off with his judicial review, is the participants have a much greater ability to accept their sentence and to cooperate with the entire process, because through the material they understand that the consequences for their victim are ongoing. What their impression prior to taking the course is often that once the trial is over, everything is done for the victim. And this material has made it really clear for them that that is not the case in the majority of situations. I was actually really early in the work, before we had the curriculum, we were just having conversations about victim impact, and that was one of the first pieces of feedback I got from the men was, I just realized the consequences for them are ongoing, and I had not thought about that before. It's like, wow, I'm surprised we're at this point before you considered it, but the important thing is that you're considering them. How am I doing for time?
Good. Got about 10 more minutes.
Okay, great. So I think I'll tell you a couple of stories about anecdotally what came out of it in the first year of running the course. As I mentioned, I was really surprised when I had 50 guys sign up and 48 finish. One actually was transferring out, and he asked to finish the material before his transfer. So that was my first run, and I ended up running 2 classes concurrently for those first 3 months because I couldn't fathom asking them to wait for programming, and I didn't want to lose their investment. Before I finished that first run, I had 50 more guys on the waiting list for the course. So in just over a year, I put 225 men through the curriculum. I shifted it so that instead of meeting once a week, we were meeting twice a week. And then I was only having to sit through that material once, one at a time, instead of watching the same videos twice a week. Was very intense. But so we finished the course in 6 weeks then, and I was able to, as I say, in just over a year, put 225 guys through the program. When I left Pittsburgh, I had 50 men on the waiting list again. The woman who has gone to replace me, Susan Gilger, has edited the curriculum. She's offering it in the same themes in a very different format. And she's running it as a very small group, 6 guys. I know she's run it once, but I'm not sure she's been able to do it more times than that because...
She's run it about 3 or 4 times
Thank you,
a year.
3 or 4 times in the year, in a much more intimate setting. And we haven't had enough chance to fully debrief that, although I know she's getting great results from the way that she's running it. And men who are taking her format are working at some really core issues. So this is a barrier for chaplains who are running it because we're turning up all this material, and then the people in the course need an opportunity to process it. And right now the staffing ratios are not such that we could do that responsibly with a larger number of men. But anyway, here's a few stories that illustrate the kind of effect we got in that first year. The story that sticks out the most to me was a young guy who had been in and out of jail all his life. He was, your stereotypical young punk with the tattoos everywhere and all that kind of stuff. And he'd had a fair bit of attitude during the class, but he came into my office once, not so long before his parole hearing, and he said, "I want to tell you what I've learned." And I said that would be great. And I didn't know, but his father had been murdered when he was 4. And he had been told about that in a very traumatic way, and told that boys don't cry. And you can't, anyway. And then the culture he was raised in was one where men are tough and men don't have feelings, but you don't hurt women and children. So this is the attitude that he's been brought up with. And as I said, we do this exercise where we put the victim and offender out and we talk about who's been hurt on every side. Well, the story I always use for that is a guy named Ed Gavigan, who is a former boxer from the University of Notre Dame who was knifed quite badly in a gang initiation ritual in New York City. It's an excellent story, and you can get it on YouTube, and I strongly encourage you to listen to it. But so here's Ed, this former boxer and tough guy, talking about how this attack had damaged his life. And this young man had only ever attacked grown men, right? Mugged them for drug money. And it blew his mind to hear a big guy like that talking about his feelings. It just totally upended his world. And so he realized, like, I have hurt real people. I have hurt men, and men other than me have feelings. And oh my word, if I don't do something about this, my son, who was about the same age he had been when his father died, if I don't do something about this, the same thing's going to happen to my kid. He's going to grow up without a father. Blah, blah, blah. So it was just like we tipped the domino, and the whole ball started to roll about how much impact he was having and how he was repeating the things that had happened to him. So that was really huge and just really blew my mind. So second guy, who I really didn't think was listening, back in the, like totally obstructive, interrupted me all the time. At one point he said something that the other guys all jumped on and we were like, "That's victim blaming." It was amazing. And he was such a pain, and I really thought I was going to kick him out. And then he came to me after the class was over and he said, "My wife sent me to thank you." Oh, I've never met your wife. What could she possibly want with me? And he said, "Well, you know, I'm in here for drugs, and I'm definitely one of those guys who thinks that I have customers, but you've shown me something different about that. But, you know, we were going through the section on domestic violence and verbal abuse, and I realized that when I'm drunk and high, I am quite verbally abusive to my wife. And I had never thought about it that way. And so I had phoned her the other day to own that and to apologize, and she sent me to thank you. So all of these, just like crime has unanticipated consequences, this class has had unanticipated consequences where people are sitting through material they don't want to sit through and they think has nothing to do with them, and they very quickly realize the relevance. I had guys taking the class who were not telling their parole officers because they weren't doing it for brownie points. They were doing it for what they could get out of it for themselves, which was fascinating to me. Pittsburgh is a minimum security institution. Some of you would know that all the programming for low-risk people was canceled. So most guys at Pittsburgh were not eligible for a program, particularly the sex offenders at Pittsburgh were not eligible for any treatment during their time there. And so they were looking to do anything they could to kind of have something to take to the parole board and say, well, at least I did the victim impact program while I was here. But there were other guys who were taking it who were not telling the parole board, who didn't even tell their parole officers. They just showed up and did their own internal work and didn't want me to write a report on them, just needed to do this for their own reasons, which was amazing to me. And the two big pieces, I think, that the institution noticed were that they had something to offer the sex offenders who otherwise wouldn't have had programming, who were mostly old men, and we were trying to get them out on parole before they died. That's a whole other story. But the drug dealers, it was really amazing how the drug dealers totally changed their attitude in the way they looked at in the way they had justified themselves in previous behavior. And nobody had really anticipated that, including me. I'd hoped for it, but I hadn't anticipated it. So it was great. The response was huge. The waiting list was huge. When I announced that I was leaving Pittsburgh Institution, a few people said they love me, but most of the parole officers said, what's going to happen to your program? Like, this is what we have to offer people right now, and what are, you know. So that said a lot to me about how much the men were gaining from that. The Victims Advisory Committee to the Correctional Service of Canada came in and had a meeting with my kind of, you know, my star graduates for sure, but were very impressed with what they saw and have asked the Correctional Service to mandate the opportunity, not participation, because we want people to do this program when they're ready. Doing it before you're ready could make you worse, but doing it when you're ready obviously could be a really good thing as long as you're properly supported. So the Victims Advisory Committee has asked for the program opportunity to be mandated. So far CSC has not bit on that at all. And then Skylar's going to tell you more about what we learned from the run in Collins Bay this year. But I'll say one brief thing about that, which is that the same thing happened at Collins Bay, where we ran the program once this year. The parole officers immediately started to say, when are you doing this again? When are you doing this again? And so far, the larger structure has not made any significant investment in the program. So that's something that we're going to continue to work towards. So, thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. Very powerful window into what's going on.